Good morning, everyone. Welcome to this presentation related to clinical data. I'm happy to welcome you for this talk. This will be happening for the next 1 hour and a half, and we will have the chance to go through different topics. I'm myself Kim Rochat. I'm heading the clinical department of Medidee service. I'm based physically and usually in Lausanne, in Switzerland. And this presentation will also be made by my colleague located in Aarhus, Madsen, who is regulatory specialist located, as I mentioned, in our office in Aarhus, and also quite active in clinical investigation aspects. And we will also have a presentation by our clinical expert, Peter Sieljacks, located also in Aarhus, who is quite active on clinical evaluation and all aspects related to data management. So during this presentation, what we will ask you is to basically keep your microphone on mute, so that way we have the chance to not have a background noise. If you have questions, please put them in the chat. There is a chatter. We will try to pick them up. We won't be able to respond directly, but we will try to collect a different question and provide answer. So don't hesitate to do it. And if we are not able to answer, you can still send us question via email afterwards. This presentation will be recorded. This is mainly for our internal purpose. I hope it's okay with everyone. So we can start directly with Madsen, and who will present the when you need to get clinical data with regard to your medical device.
Yes, hello, good morning, everyone. My name is Bräuner Madsen, and as Kim mentioned, I will talk you through when you need some clinical data on your medical device, and I will talk from the regulatory perspective here. The agenda for the next 20 to 30 minutes you see here, I will talk about some timeline of the new regulation we see. Then I will briefly show you some steps for the typical pathway to the market. Then I will look on defining what clinical data is and when you need them. And then I'll go through some of the typical steps where you utilize these clinical data. So initially we have the timeline here for the new regulation. When we say the regulation, we refer to the new medical device regulation, and we abbreviate it as the MDR. The MDR was published on May 5th, 2017, and entered into force on May 25, also 2017, and will, after this transition period of now 4 years, be applicable from May 26, 2021. Originally, the date of application was here on May 26, 2020, but due to the outbreak of COVID-19, the European Parliament has postponed the date of application with 1 year. So from next year, approximately 1 year from now, the MDR is fully applicable, meaning that if you manufacture medical devices, you will have to comply with this regulation. So to put the need for clinical data into perspective of the typical medical device development stages seen from the regulatory perspective, we have illustrated it quite schematic with these 12 steps, where you start with the product definition and define your intended purpose of the device, go through a product classification through to the conformity assessment of your device. Then you look on what is the quality management system requirements to your device, go through the general safety and performance requirements through to the risk analysis. Step 7 here is where you compile your clinical evaluation or make your clinical strategy, over to the product verification through to the clinical validation. This is typically where you execute clinical investigations if they are needed. And then you compile your technical documentation before you clear your conformity and hopefully achieve your CE mark, and then you are on the market doing step 12 and do some of your vigilance activities. And what you will also realize during this short presentation today is that many of the steps we talk about here are interconnected and feeds information into each other, meaning that you will have to take several steps into account simultaneously. So these processes are really interconnected with each other. Today I'll go around or put some emphasis on these 3 steps, step 7, step 9, and step 12 in this medical device development. So it's important that you have these 3 steps in mind throughout this presentation. So what is clinical data? In the MDR article 2.51, they define clinical evidence as the following. Clinical evidence means clinical data and clinical evaluation results pertaining to a device of sufficient amount and quality to allow a qualified assessment of whether the device is safe and achieves the intended clinical benefits when used as intended by the manufacturer. What this basically means is that clinical evidence is all the information you can derive from the use of the device you have under evaluation. So to put it very clear, for all types of medical devices, all classes of medical devices, you will need some kind of clinical data. And of course, there are some factors which influences to which extent you will need these clinical data. First of all, you look on the regulatory classification of the device you have. And that will also decide how much data you'll need to collect. Of course, it's obvious that you'll need to have more clinical data if you develop an artificial heart valve than if you manufacture plastic gloves. Then there's also a concern about the patient or user's exposure to the product. And it's relevant if the product solely has a surface contact with the skin of the patient versus if the device is intended for implantation in the patient, meaning that you will have more data the more exposure the patient has, so to say. And of course, there are some potential risks associated with the use of the device, which is also a factor. Are there many risks associated with the procedure where the device is intended? For example, if it's doing operation that you need to use the data. And already here, take note of the word risk, as you saw in the 12 steps. The risk management activities were placed a bit earlier than these data capture areas. But this is a good illustration that you really need to feed the processes into each other. And finally, also some of the claims you present on your device is also of great importance when road mapping your clinical need for or the need for clinical data, and really relates to the intended purpose of the device and what you claim your device can do and can be used for. So to speak a bit more about when clinical data is needed, our advice is really to compile your clinical strategy at an early stage of this device development. This is quite well illustrated in Article 61.1, where the MDR says the following: the manufacturer shall specify and justify the level of clinical evidence necessary to demonstrate conformity with the relevant general safety and performance requirements. That level of clinical evidence shall be appropriate in view of the characteristics of the device and its intended purpose. So basically what Article 61 is stating is the need to establish your clinical strategy early. It is recommended to do it already during the clinical evaluation step, as illustrated in step 7 in 12 steps I showed you in the beginning. And already here establish your clinical evaluation plan. In this way, you will plan how to capture the necessary data to show safety and performance of your device, and enough data to justify the claims you make on your device. The next is the clinical evaluation, which is quite an important step in where you use the clinical data. It's illustrated in Article 10.3 of the MDR. Manufacturers shall conduct a clinical evaluation in accordance with the requirements set out in Article 61 and Annex 14, including a PMCF. And a clinical evaluation is a structured ongoing procedure to collect, appraise, and analyze clinical data pertaining to a medical device, and it's executed in order to assess the validity of the safety and performance claims you make. The input here can be clinical data, preclinical data, data from literature review or safety database searches. And at a later stage, you can also utilize post-market surveillance data and PMCF data. I'll also talk a bit more about PMS and PMCF data in a while. But the expected outcome of such clinical evaluation is complete substantiation of the claims made by you as a manufacturer. And this is also required for all classes of medical devices. Jumping to the next step where you talk about clinical data on your medical device is a clinical investigation. This was illustrated in step 9 of the 12 steps I showed you in the beginning. It is a requirement to carry out clinical investigations for all implantable devices and all class 3 medical devices. Of course, there are some exemptions. For example, you can claim equivalence to another device, but that will require that you have full access to the technical documentation of that equivalent device. So it actually requires that you have a contract in place with the other manufacturer, allowing you to have full access to the technical documentation on an ongoing basis, which can prove quite difficult in many cases. And additionally, when we talk about clinical investigations, there are some other rules applying to other types of medical devices than the implantable and class 3 devices. And that is, if they possess any of the 3 following points, they will also require this clinical investigation. And that is if your device is a novel technology, or there is a new clinical use for an existing technology, or if there are gaps in the clinical data with regards to the identification of the benefits, risk, claims, or side effects. And when we talk about clinical investigations under the MDR, it is a bit more difficult to justify that the safety and performance claims are met by clinical literature and data on equivalent devices alone, compared to the previous practice. So in the future, or as we talk about now, the future is here, since we run under the MDR already, there will be more clinical investigations. So we also have the possibility to talk about clinical data post-market. Post-market means that when you have achieved your CE mark and already operates on the market. It is illustrated in Article 10.10 of the MDR, and it states, manufacturers of devices shall implement and keep up to date the post-market surveillance systems in accordance with Article 83. And this is a new requirement in the MDR compared to previous practice, and it implies that the manufacturer proactively and systematically gather information on the device throughout the lifetime of the device. And post-market surveillance is a part of the quality management system, and it feeds into the technical documentation of the device. Post-market surveillance data shall be used to update the benefit risk determination on your device, shall be used to update the clinical evaluation, and shall be used to update the information on safety and clinical performance. And again, you see this is really an illustration that these processes feed into each other, and it's not like you can complete one process and then go to the next step. They really feed into each other continuously. As part of PMS data, we also talk about PMCF, I've already mentioned Article 10.3 when we spoke about the clinical evaluation, but it's worth to notice that in Article 10 you also include PMCF data. What is PMCF data? That is an abbreviation for post-market clinical follow-up, and it's illustrated in the MDR Annex 14 Part B. And when you collect these PMCF data, it is to confirm the safety and performance throughout the expected lifetime of the device, and you do to identify and analyze emerging risks on the basis of factual evidence. So this really allows you to collect data from the use of the device in the clinical setting your device is intended to operate. And you use them to ensure that the benefit risk ratio is still acceptable on your device. Yeah, and this factual evidence I briefly talked about before is really should be used to fill in the gaps from your pre-market activities. For example, where you have utilized some preclinical data before you went on the market, you now have access to clinical data captured on the market, and with this data you can substantiate the claims you make on your device. And like so many other processes, the PMCF is a continuous process and should feed into the continuous work in your clinical evaluation. And the captured data should be evaluated as part of the risk management process. In addition to your PMS reports and PMCF reports, you must also compile a summary of those activities in what is called a periodic safety update report. And this PSOR must be provided to your notified body. And as mentioned before, you have to include a description of the PMS data and findings from the PMCF, and also include the conclusions from your clinical evaluation reports. And as mentioned, the PSOR must be provided to your notified body. So this illustrates that you really need your clinical data, because you will have to get it approved. And the goal of the PSOR is to confirm to your notified body that your device still holds a positive benefit risk profile. And this is just a short table to show the requirements on when you have to provide these PSOR data to your notified body. As you see, for a class 2A device, you'll have to provide your notified body with a PSOR report every second year, and on a class 2B it's every year. So this really emphasizes that you have to have clinical data at some point. So this was just a quick and brief overview of the regulatory requirements pertaining to the clinical data of your medical device. And the next step we would like to present to you is how to capture those data in the correct way and at the correct time, and Peter will guide you through that. So we will just change the slides to just stay online, and there's just some technical here. Thank you for listening to me.
And good morning, everyone. My name is Peter, and I will present to you today the sources that you can utilize in order to get these clinical data that Mads just outlined why is so important. So you can see the agenda here. And I'm based in Aarhus together with Mads, also primarily working on the clinical aspects of medical devices. I've outlined here the three main sources that you have for clinical data. Those are clinical investigations, scientific literature, adverse event databases, and data coming from PMS or PMCF activities. The clinical investigation is this is something that Kim will elaborate a bit about in his presentations, but clinical investigations is mainly clinical studies conducted with your own device in humans, and as Mads mentions, those are required for the implantable and class 3 devices and are subjected to pretty stringent regulatory requirements, and they need to comply with those requirements in order to be accepted by the notified body. So for many companies, it's attractive to avoid doing clinical investigations, at least initially, because it is a large effort, it is costly. So you have these other three sources of clinical data that you can utilize. The scientific literature and the adverse event databases is what we also call public available data. And this data can be either from your own device, if you have the device on the market and it has been used in some clinical studies not conducted by yourself. These studies will be published on in scientific journals, and you can utilize the data from these studies to demonstrate safety and performance of your own device. Alternatively, you can use data coming from an equivalent device. I will elaborate a little bit about this process in the next slides. But the concept here is that you can, if you have a device which is very equivalent and has similar characteristics as your own device, you can utilize data coming from studies conducted with that device to demonstrate performance and safety of your own device. And finally, you have PMS and PMCF data. This is, of course, only applicable to devices that are already on the market. And there are many activities under PMS and PMCF. The three main ones I have chosen here are those that I consider the most important ones in order to source clinical data. And those are PMCF studies, PMCF surveys, and customer feedbacks. In the next slides, I will elaborate a bit about these four sources of clinical data. What I wanted to do also is to point out, because we have talked a little bit about clinical data right now, but it is also important to notice what is not considered clinical data. So what you cannot use to demonstrate safety and performance. And the data that is not considered clinical data is mainly data that is coming from preclinical tests. This means studies on animals or bench testing or verification testings and stuff like that. Also, data that are coming from magazines or not scientific journals is not considered valid enough to be accepted as clinical data. And lastly, also data collected under conditions that do not comply with the regulations is not considered valid for demonstrating performance and safety. And this means that if you have done clinical investigations that do not comply with the MDR requirements and good clinical practice, you are at risk of those data being not accepted by the notified body. So that's a very strong incentive to follow these regulatory requirements when doing your clinical investigations. So in the next slide here, I want to elaborate a little bit about these equivalent devices, because this is a very important concept that you can utilize if you have a device that you want to CE mark, but you don't have any data on your own device, either from clinical investigations or from the scientific literature. So you have to rely on data coming from a already marketed device. So this concept of equivalence, this allows you to demonstrate performance and safety based on clinical data coming from literature databases and adverse event databases of an already marketed device. This is a very attractive approach for many companies because this will allow you to circumvent the need for doing clinical investigations and also for devices that are not on the market yet. In order for you to utilize this strategy of sourcing clinical data from equivalent devices, you will need to demonstrate that your device is equivalent to the device that you're claiming equivalence to. And this means that you need to go through all the characteristics of your own device and the device you're claiming equivalence to. And you must demonstrate that these are similar to the extent that there would be no clinical significant difference in the safety and clinical performance of the device. And this means going through all the clinical, technical, and biological characteristics of these devices. And for each of these characteristics, you need to show or demonstrate whether these devices can be considered to be equivalent or not. For some of the characteristics, it is not enough that the devices are similar. For some of the characteristics, it is explicitly required that the characteristics are exactly the same. This, for example, goes to the material that is in contact with the patient. So if you have two devices where the part of the device which is in contact with the patient are not the same, you cannot claim equivalence. If they are the same, you can, if all the other characteristics are also acceptable. In order to do this demonstration of equivalence, you need to demonstrate that you have, and I'm just quoting here, sufficient level of access to the data relating to the devices with which they are claiming equivalence in order to justify their claims of equivalence. And this means you need to have data to show that your devices are equivalent. And this data for the lower risk classes, class 1 to 2B non-implantable devices, this could be, for example, the instructions for use, any technical manuals that you can find, 510Ks from US submissions, or data that you can source from scientific literature. As Mads mentioned, if you want to use this strategy for implantable and class 3 devices, in order to demonstrate sufficient level of access to these data, you need to have access to the technical documentation. And this is, of course, not an issue if you have if the equivalent device is your own device too, if it's manufactured by you. But if you have an equivalent device which is manufactured by another manufacturer, this can pose as a very big challenge, because I'm pretty sure not many companies would allow you to gain access to their technical documentation on an ongoing basis. And then this kind of strategy is very, very difficult. In order to demonstrate this equivalence to your claimed equivalent device, you need to do considerations based on proper scientific justification. And this is a kind of a new requirement that you need to do this. And it is now recommended that you reference data to substantiate your claim of these characteristics not being clinically significantly different. And what you can use there is literature, and here for demonstration of equivalent of some of the characteristics, it is accepted to use animal and preclinical studies, but you can also make your own data. So you can buy the equivalent device and you can do comparative tests in order to be able to demonstrate that your device and the device that you're claiming equivalence to have the similar characteristics. But at the end of the day, this strategy is very challenging, mainly because of the increasing regulatory requirements and the awareness, and also the evolving opinion of the notified bodies. Because at the end of the day, it's the notified body who's gonna decide whether he will accept or not accept the claimed equivalent device. And it can be a risky process if you're not absolutely confident that you have an equivalent device which will be accepted by the notified body. So currently, CE marking based solely on data from equivalent devices can prove pretty difficult under MDR. So it is recommended to also utilize other sources of clinical data. So other sources of clinical data can be, of course, these clinical investigations that Kim will elaborate a little bit about. So, but I just want to point out some practical considerations in terms of who should run such a clinical investigations, because there are some thoughts to be made here. What you can do is you can hire a clinical research organization to run your entire clinical investigation, from the planning of it until the report. This is, of course, the easiest way to do it, but also the most expensive way to do it. So if you want to decrease the costs and if you have in-house competences, you can do, as a manufacturer, you can do or run the clinical investigation yourself, either with or without support of a clinical research organization. The clinical research organization can, for example, support in activities like monitoring the clinical study or ensuring compliance of the clinical investigation plan with the regulatory requirements and other subtasks during such a clinical investigation. Finally, you can rely on collaboration with universities or university hospitals. And in universities and university hospitals, you have very strong scientific and clinical competences, which can be very attractive to use for your clinical investigations. And it's obviously cheaper because usually their salary will be paid by the university itself. But what you need to be aware of here, and Kim will also elaborate a bit about on this, is that they are not always used to working under the regulatory requirements of the MDR, and maybe not also on the GCP. And as I mentioned earlier, you need to be very sure that all your clinical investigations do comply with those requirements in order for the notified body to accept those. So this is a very important point that you need to be aware of if you collaborate with universities, that these investigations should follow the regulatory requirements. Other sources of clinical data you can source from publicly available data. And in order to demonstrate safety and performance using clinical data from the literature, you can use these sources of data. For the scientific literature, you will have to identify studies on the device or with an equivalent device. And these studies need to be published in scientific journals. So that's, again, magazine articles and poster presentations from conferences and other sources of data are not accepted. So you need to have clinical studies that are published in scientific journals. It is generally limited to original studies on humans, which means that usually you cannot utilize reviews, opinion papers, abstracts, presentations, and other sources of data. So you need to have original studies where you can scrutinize the methodology, the data analysis, and all those kinds of aspects. The way you collect these data should be through a predefined and scientifically valid methodology. So you need to define keyword searches, and you need to build those keyword searches and execute those searches on scientific databases. And it is strongly recommended to search multiple databases, including Embase, PubMed, and Google Scholar. What we sometimes see is that manufacturers only search Google Scholar, and this is not acceptable because Google Scholar is basically not a state-of-the-art literature search database. So you need to search also Embase or PubMed. Those papers that you retrieve through those searches, you need to do an inclusion-exclusion process based on predefined criteria. And for the papers that you include, you will do an objective appraisal of the quality of the collected papers. And that goes into demonstrating the weight of the evidence. So if you only have poorly designed studies with inconclusive data, well, the weight of the evidence in order to demonstrate performance and safety would be low. On the other hand, if you have several double-blinded randomized controlled trials with a lot of patients in each of the trials, well, then you have another weight of clinical evidence that you can use to demonstrate safety and performance. For these publicly available data, you also have adverse event databases. These databases are typically maintained by the competent authorities of each of the countries. And you will find through those databases, you can find recalls, incident, field corrective actions. And for the US databases, you can also find reports made by physicians in terms of faulty devices, incidents that have happened, and so forth. So this goes into your clinical data related to the safety of the device. And you need to identify those events, and you need to analyze those events. You need to see if you can identify the root cause. You need to look at how is the severity of those incidents, were in patient injury and stuff like that. And what is very useful here is to compare the number of events to the sales volumes and or the usage of the device. So if you have a device where you identify 10 safety events, but you have sold 1 million devices, well, obviously this goes to leveraging that, well, my device is safe because I only had 10 events and I sold 1 million devices. On the other hand, if you have a sales volume of 10 and you have 5 incidents, well, then you have a 50% incident rate, and this is not very good for demonstrating safety. The last source of clinical data is the PMS and PMCF. So of course, this can only be sourced from devices that are already on the market. And you have many activities under PMS and PMCF, and I have just chosen 3 of those which I consider the most important in terms of demonstrating safety and performance. Generally, PMS and PMCF can be used to confirm the safety and performance of a device. So you cannot use it for the initial CE marking. Of course, you don't have the device on the market yet. But if you have done an initial CE marking, for example, for an equivalent device, and you need to confirm that this is also true for your own device, you can utilize some PMS and PMCF activities in order to confirm that your device actually are, you can actually demonstrate that or confirm that your device is safe and performs as intended through PMCF activities. The most solid way of collecting these data is to do PMCF studies. PMCF studies are justified in a range of circumstances. And this goes, for example, to if you have unanswered questions in terms of the long-term safety and performance. So if you have in your literature review of clinical data or your clinical investigations, you only have follow-up periods of, let's say, 6 months, but this is an implant which will stay in the body for 10 years, well, then you can utilize PMCF studies to get data on what is the long-term outcome of this implant. And what is important to note here is that the guidances from the Medical Device Coordination Group actually states that these PMCF studies are justified when CE marking was based on equivalence. And this means that if you have an equivalent or a device which was based solely on data coming from an equivalent device, you need to strongly consider also doing a PMCF study and also to confirm that this data was also valid for your own device. These PMCF studies are more easy to conduct in terms of the regulatory requirements. So if you have a device which is already on the market and is CE mark, and you do the clinical or you do the PMCF study within the intended purpose of the device, you have less regulatory requirements, but you still have some specific sections of the MDR that apply, such as you need to have ethical approval and stuff like that. Examples of what can be a PMCF study can range from a PMCF investigation, which will to a very large extent be much like the same as a clinical investigation done during the pre-market process. But you need to remember that the device can only be used within its intended purpose. So you cannot do a PMCF study to extend the intended use or to use the device without its intended use. Then you need to do a proper clinical investigation. Another neat trick you can do in order to use PMCF studies is to just extend the follow-up of patients who were enrolled in pre-market investigations. That way you already have done all the recruitment of the patients and you can collect these data in a much more efficient way than doing a whole new PMCF study by just extending the follow-up of the already running study. And lastly, you can do retrospective observational studies, and this is of course possible because you have the device on the market and it is in use in the clinical practice. So in order to extract data from there, you can do these observational studies, and these studies are much cheaper than doing the prospective investigations. And also these studies allow for collecting of clinical data for devices which are not very suitable for prospective studies. I, for example, have an example that for a device, this device was used during a surgical procedure, and there are many types of this device. It was a catheter, and during this procedure, the surgeon will pick and choose, depending on how the procedure goes, he will pick and choose from a wide range of catheters. So you cannot randomize the surgeon to only use your catheter, because you will need to have different types of catheters with different types of properties. So for this case, we recommended to doing a retrospective observational studies in order to see what were the outcome of those procedures where our device was used compared to those procedures where it was not used. And as a manufacturer, you know where you have sold your device, so you know which hospitals and you know which departments are using your device. A less solid way, but still a very valuable way of collecting PMCF data is from surveys. And these surveys can be more or less systematic. They can range from simple questionnaires that you send out to the treating physicians, but they can also be what I would say is somewhere in the crossfield between a PMCF study and a PMCF survey, where you do a very systematic and structured PMCF surveys on, for example, patient-reported outcomes. This is, for example, applicable if you have devices which patients use at home, wearable devices, or if you have implantable devices that you need to have some patient-reported outcomes of. This could example, be the quality of life of the patient, or any pain that the patient is experiencing, whether this device has improved functionality and stuff like that. And these surveys, I think, is very valuable to collect clinical data. What you can also use in these PMCF surveys is that you can leverage that you can also gather some data on the usability of your device, because in many ways, what you can do is you can ask if the device is easy to use, if it is intuitive to use, if you have a graphic display, if the graphic display is intuitive. So you can not only collect clinical data, but you can also begin collecting usability data from these surveys, because that is a very subjective type of data. What you need to be aware of in terms of these PMCF surveys is that in order to have solid data from these PMCF surveys, you need to follow kind of the same procedure as you do for clinical investigations, and that is have compile a survey plan which states what would be the outcome of this survey, how will which data will we collect, how will we analyze, and how will we report the data at the end. So this ensures that you can show that we have collected these data in a proper way and we have analyzed it in a proper way, and this increases the weight of those data collected through PMCF surveys. The last one here is customer complaints. So you are required to have vigilance data and PMS data, and through that you will collect any complaints coming from customers or patients, and you can do a clinical review, so you can identify the clinical relevance of those data, and you can use that to show or demonstrate performance of safety. Again, this should be leveraged and put into perspective in terms of the sales volumes of the devices. And this is not only clinical data to demonstrate safety and performance, but much of these data can also be used for product improvement and be used as input for development of the products and update of the products. Lastly, I just wanted to point out that what you should do if you have devices on the market is to collect data from different PMCF activities, because each of those activities can provide you with different types of data, and they can complement each other. So it is very strongly recommended to collect those data from different sources and put those into your clinical evaluation. For this next slide here, I wanted to put some of these sources of data into the perspective of when to use which sources and which factors do influence what kind of clinical data I need from which source. And in this first example here, I have an example of a device which is a new device. So this is a device that is undergoing development for initial CE marking. And for this first part here, the first thing that you need to do for such a device is to do a very thorough literature review of the clinical background and state of the art within the field, the medical field that this device is used. This will allow you to identify what are the clinical characteristics, what are the performance characteristics of these devices, and that you need to make sure that your device also complies with. So this provides input to how to demonstrate performance and safety. This will also provide potential input to what outcomes should be included in clinical investigations. And during that process, you'll probably also identify some potential equivalent devices. And if you do that, you can begin checking your equivalents to those existing devices. So you can go through their clinical, their biological, and their technical characteristics and see if you can demonstrate that your device is equivalent to this device. If you have gaps in data in order for you to demonstrate that equivalence, you can begin collecting those data. You can do preclinical tests or bench testing in order to be able to demonstrate equivalence. But at the end, you may come up with the conclusion that, well, there are no equivalent devices, so we need to rely on data from our own device. And then you go through this route here, and then you make your clinical investigation plan, you conduct your clinical investigation, your report, and then you apply for your CE marking, and then you confirm that your device is actually safe and performs as intended through PMCF. On the other hand, if you can find equivalent devices, you can review the literature from the clinical data from the literature or the adverse event databases, and what you can source from that, those studies that are published there, you need to very thoroughly review those in order to determine if that is enough, if the level of evidence is enough to demonstrate safety and performance of your device, or if there are any major gaps in the clinical data. If there are any major gaps in clinical data, that could, for example, be very low quality of the papers, or only single-arm studies and no comparative studies, stuff like that, then you may end up with the conclusion that in order to close those gaps, you need to go back and do a clinical investigation before you have your CE marking. If you can justify that those gaps that you identify are only minor gaps, this could be, for example, uncertainties regarding very rare complications or the very long-term use of the device, you can justify doing a PMCF to close those gaps, and you can actually CE mark your device, and then you close those gaps through a PMCF. I just want to point out here that it is not the sequence of events here is not necessarily the way you always go. You may, for equivalent devices, you may start by reviewing the clinical data on different potential equivalent devices in order to see if it's worth the effort to demonstrate equivalence. Because if you don't have any solid clinical data coming from the literature on equivalent devices anyway, well, then there's really no need to go through all this process of demonstrating equivalence. Another example here from a existing device which are CE marked and is based on equivalent devices under the Medical Device Directive. And this is a case that we have encountered multiple times. If you have such a device on the market, you need to very thoroughly review if the equivalent device is still valid under MDR. So you need to go through all those clinical, biological, and technical characteristics and check for each of those if they can be considered to be similar to the extent that there is no clinically significant difference in performance and safety. And remember that you need to have data to substantiate that these devices are not too different for that to be claimed. And if you have any old devices that has been on the market for years and years, you should be very aware that your device has not drifted in design, which means that in iterative updates of the device, you may end up with a device that is not equivalent to the device that you originally claimed equivalence to. If you end up with the conclusion that your device cannot be claimed to be equivalent to the other device anymore, you need to do a PMCF investigation right away to close those gaps in order to be ready for the application of MDR. If you have still an equivalent device, if you can claim equivalence to the original device, you should do the same thing as for the new device. You need to review any clinical data gaps with respect to MDR. So you need to go through all the clinical data coming from those from the literature, and you need to check if they still can be considered valid under MDR. If you define any gaps in this, then it is time to do some PMCF to close those gaps. We have some special cases in which what I just told you here is for the normal how it normally is, but we have some special cases where there are some other recommendations that we can make. For example, if you have software where is special because this already logs data when it is being used, and you can have your device communicate this data to yourself as a manufacturer. You need to remember GDPR rules, and you can use those data to demonstrate that your device performs as you intend, or you can use those data for other purposes. One example, I just made that example up, but one example could be if you have a cell phone based application that can be used to measure heart rate or some heart rate characteristics. Well, you have those data logged on your device, and you can use that to, if that device is intended to provide some sort of cardiac parameters that can be used to detect an abnormal cardiac function. That could be the case. Well, then you can use proactive patients follow-ups to detect if your device, for example, has detected an abnormal cardiac rhythm in a patient, and you have those data on your app, you can proactively follow up with that patient if that patient have actually gone to the hospital and have an ECG to check if they had an abnormal cardiac rhythm, and you can validate if your device was correct in diagnosing that abnormal cardiac rhythm. And there are many examples of how software can utilize the fact that it is software based and already collects data. So software manufacturers need to be aware of this possibility and the ways how to utilize this. Also, you may have devices where you consider those to not be deemed appropriate for collection of clinical data. This will be based on the risk analysis and the intended clinical performance claims of the device. So if you have, for example, a device that does not come into directly contact with the patient, it doesn't have any clinical claims, its clinical performance is mainly of technical character, it may be suitable for what we call a performance-based CER or clinical evaluation. And that is where we use preclinical data, V&V test reports, to show that this device has the technical performance characteristics that are necessary in order to achieve its intended purpose. And this is the case for many accessory tools or devices used during more comprehensive procedures, because you can potentially have a surgical procedure where you implant a defibrillator in the heart, and you will use different tools in order to access the site in the heart, and those tools may not be very appropriate for collecting clinical data, because there will be no clinical data, and it's very difficult to collect clinical data specifically for those type of devices. And there you can potentially go through a performance-based evaluation instead. I just listed some examples here. This could be contrast injectors for MRI procedures, blood bag heaters, blood storage bags for stem cell transplantation, ECG recorders, and other types of devices. So in order to have the CE marking for those devices, you can do performance tests and use other types of preclinical data in order to have your initial CE marking, and then you do PMCF studies to confirm, or PMCF activities to confirm safety and performance. Lastly, you have devices which have to comply with very specific standards for clinical investigations. So you have devices where there are standards who show what you need to do and which outcomes and how many patients you need to include in your clinical investigations. And this is very great if you are aware of those standards, because that allows you to easily design your clinical investigations in order to be accepted by the notified body. But if you are not aware of those standards, you can end up spending a lot of money and a lot of time, a lot of effort on doing clinical investigations which do not comply with these specific standards, and they will not be accepted by the notified body, and it will be a huge waste of time. So you need to be aware of those. It's, for example, goes to contact lenses, blood pressure devices, monitors, or intraocular lenses. These are just 3 examples of devices that falls into that category. So the conclusion from this session here is that these clinical investigation will undergo increased scrutiny by the notified body, and they will need to be updated, as Mads mentioned, with PMS and PMCF activities throughout the lifetime of the device. And these clinical investigations is a very large effort, it's a very large investment, so you need to allocate a lot of resources to this. Also, CE marking based only on literature without any clinical investigations or PMCF studies will be very, very difficult. So for those of you who have devices on the market already, you need to incorporate PMCF studies now. And there are increasing stringent requirements for demonstrating equivalence, which means that you need to review your equivalent devices if they still are valid. And lastly, this is the good news, that PMCF is a very useful for preparation under MDR. So you can collect, as I mentioned, a lot of data coming from PMS and PMCF that you can use to demonstrate safety and performance. So in this way, you can circumvent the need for doing a clinical investigation. So our recommendations for now is to perform a gap analysis of your equivalence demonstration with respect to MDR and collect data to close those gaps. You need to perform a clinical data gap analysis. You need to check the quality of the data that you can derive from the literature, and you need to see if all those data that you can collect from the literature still is able to substantiate all the clinical claims that you make. And this is both the existing ones and the future ones. And what we need to mention here is that clinical claims is all the claims regarding how your device performs that we can find anywhere, either in the instructions for use, on the website, in marketing materials. So it is basically everything that's publicly available and consists of claims that you make. You need to be able to substantiate those through clinical data. And you need to begin reviewing your clinical evaluation reports of your existing devices and define those actions that you need to take in order to make those MDR compliant. So bottom line, you need to start collecting clinical data now. This was the talk that I had for you today, and I will hand over the screen to Kim, who will go a little bit more into detail about the clinical investigations and what you need to be aware of in terms of having those accepted from a regulatory perspective.
Yes. Thank you, Peter. And then all the others just stay online. Then we just have the technical issue again with giving Kim the microphone.
Good morning again, everyone. I will just take the opportunity to answer 2 questions which have been placed in the chatter. One of the first question, or the second question, was actually if using clinical, having the device cleared by the FDA would be useful with regards to the CE mark. There is basically two answers here. The first answer is that it's always interesting to have your technical data and your clinical data reviewed by a competent authority, especially by the FDA, who is quite a stringent competent authority. So in that sense, if your device is cleared, it means that you went through a clearance process, so somebody has reviewed your data. So that can be interesting in that way. But from a purely CE approach with your notified body, this doesn't bring any input. So the notified body is not going to take into consideration if your device is being marketed in another geographic area such as the US. And to some extent, you also have to take care that rules between the US and between Europe might be a bit different, which means that you may have some decision made by the US which might not be applicable in Europe. I had once the example where we said that the FDA was accepting one specific point. I was saying that to a German notified body, and the German notified body simply told me that we are not in the US here. So you cannot necessarily leverage opinion from other competent authority which are not related to the CE mark. The second question was with regards to GDPR. So of course, when you're doing PMCF, when you're doing PMS activities, you're collecting data, and those data may be pertaining to individual. And according to the General Data Protection Regulation that we have now in Europe, those data might be considered as sensitive data, and those data need to be collected in a proportional way. And also, and most important of everything, people need to have provided the consent. Now, with regard to clinical data per se, normally, as a reminder, in clinical data, you never collect the patient information. So those, I mean, the identification of the patient. So of course, the clinician has the possibility to link the patient information to the parameters, but normally the manufacturer should never access patient data that identify the patient, him or herself. This is the principle of pseudonymization. And if you're collecting data typically through software and you're proactively collecting data, then you would definitely ensure that you have asked the permission of the user to do so. So you would actually have a process where they give their consent for you to use their data as for research or for quality control. Or you want to ensure that those data are collected anonymously. If the data are truly anonymized, then you're not subject to the requirement of the GDPR. So I hope this answered the two questions. If you have other questions, feel free to continue to post them in the chat. I will now move with the presentation with regards to the clinical investigation themselves. And I wanted to share with you in the coming half an hour roughly some key consideration that you may be willing to take in to follow. So as a basic statement, we can say that within the medical device community for manufacturers, when we're doing clinical research, it's mainly to evaluate effectiveness and safety of a therapeutic product, so typically our medical devices. Of course, there is within universities and other actors reasons to do clinical research, which is really to identify or understand specific aspects related to the human body. But I mean, normally a medical device manufacturers is mainly doing clinical research in order to collect data to justify safety and performance of its device. So what we can say very basically is that at the end of the process of the clinical investigation, what you're mainly willing to have is data supporting the claim associated with your device. So as mentioned by Peter, you will make multiple claims in your marketing material, in your instruction for use, and maybe in presentation, in symposium, and so on and so forth. And all those claims that you're going to make with regard to your device must be substantiated by clinical data. This corona situation, this COVID-19 situation, raised a very interesting controversy. I don't know how much all of you have been able to follow that up, but in southern France, in Marseille, there is one specialist with regard to a virologist, somebody really investigating infectious disease, has basically started clinical investigation in order to demonstrate that chloroquine was useful to treat patients with COVID-19. And what was really interesting is that the whole scientific community have basically been extremely skeptical about the study has been designed. So, I mean, there was multiple questions on the design itself, on the type of patient, and on multiple questions. And at the end of the day, it's quite interesting to see that even if you take a key opinion leader in that field, designing a study, making media communication and so on and so forth, at the end of the day, the scientific community did not really follow, or at least not all of the scientific community followed the, this professor. So what you definitely want to avoid, well, you don't want to go in the press, obviously, but what you definitely want to avoid is that you have data which are robust enough to demonstrate your claim. If in the process of conformity assessment process, the notified body comes back to you and question your data and the quality of your data, that can be a significant issue, because that will prevent you to access the market with your device, or even worse, that may actually push the competent authority to force you to withdraw your device from the market. So clinical data are fundamental to access the market. And through our experience with Medidee, we had multiple cases where we had issues with notified body. Typically, we had one issue with DNV, the Norwegian notified body, where we had discussion on statistical aspects. So basically, we come with a study and they question the statistic that was presented. So we had to demonstrate that the statistical approach was sufficient and acceptable. We also had discussion with TÜV Süd, the German notified body, where they were actually challenging the design aspect, so the endpoint that were selected by the manufacturers to demonstrate safety and performance. We also had example with BSI, the British notified body, where basically they were questioning what we call the demographics, so basically the nature of the patient which were enrolled and the claim which were associated. So at the end of the day, those situations happen, so you need to be quite careful on how you plan and organize the collect of clinical data. It's becoming more and more important, as was presented by Mads at the beginning of this presentation, because what we see is that compared to the current directive, the medical device directive, the new medical device regulation is reinforcing quite substantially the need to demonstrate safety and performance through clinical evidence. One of the indication is all the recommendation related to the clinical evaluation itself. So we see that we have these MDCG guidances which have been published that define typically how we want to do equivalence, what kind of summary of safety and clinical performance data we have to do. We also have other international guidance, typically like EMDRF Forum, who are creating guidances on how to address a clinical evaluation and the quality of the clinical data. If you go through the MDR, you're also going to see that there is an increased expectation in terms of competences the notified body must have. So notified body now must be able to demonstrate that the reviewer that they allocate to during the conformity assessment process, who review clinical data, have the necessary competences to review those data. In addition to this, the MDR now directly includes requirement for the clinical investigation. In the previous regulation, we mainly had one annex that was giving, let's say, high-level expectation. Now, in this Article 62 to 80 and the Annex 15, we have detailed requirement on how the clinical investigation should be set up and run. We also have a procedure which has been introduced for some of the Class 2B devices, and for most of the implantable class 3 devices, so that's the Article 54, where you have a consultation procedure. This consultation procedure is quite what we would call a killer to some extent, is that if you have an implantable class 3 devices, what your notified body will have to do is that it will have to share the review of your clinical evaluation with the commission, so basically with an expert panel who will actually review and confirm their own assessment. So what we can see here is that at the end of the day, the clinical evidence is becoming a central topic for every devices. That may sound a little bit surprising because, I mean, clinical data was always a source of justification for safety or performance. But what we see from the MDD, the previous regulation, and now the new regulation, is that to some extent the European Parliament decided to raise the bar of the quality of clinical data to some extent to be comparable to what is happening in the pharmaceutical world. So nowadays and for the future, you cannot really expect placing your device on the market with a thorough approach with regard to collecting and using clinical evidences. In addition to this, one needs to keep in mind that the medical device industry is following the same, let's say, general principle as you would find in every highly regulated industry. In the 50s, we had this gentleman, Mr. Deming, who was to some extent the father of the quality management approach, where he defined more or less a logic, which was his Deming wheel that we have here, which is this famous plan, do, check, act that you may have seen in multiple situations. This logic also apply in terms of clinical investigation, how we collect clinical evidences. There is a strong expectation from notified bodies, competent authorities, that the activities done to collect this data are controlled. And when we say that they're controlled, it means that they have been correctly planned. So we systematically have a plan, a protocol, or something that define the activities that will be undertaken. Then the activities are being performed, then the activities are being checked. So we are sure that what activities have been done, they are consistent with what was planned. And of course, if there is inconsistencies, then there is action taken in order to correct. So this approach needs to be systematically followed when you do clinical investigation, and this is done to ensure that the data which are collected are really reliable and trustworthy. So making, let's say, a quick and dirty study to collect some data is something that is unlikely to be very efficient to demonstrate what you have to demonstrate. So at the end of the day, you need to have good planning activity to ensure that you cover the different aspects of research. Maybe just a quick word on notified bodies. I would assume that everyone knows what is notified body, but just to be sure that we all align on this, the notified body is a private company which is accredited by its states, and this notified body has the responsibility under MDR to make the so-called conformity assessment process. What it means that the notified body is going to review the documentation that you're going to provide to this organization, and they're going to verify that the documentation that you provide is actually correctly addressing the general safety and performance requirement you have in the MDR. So this is a full review of your technical file, and once they agree that you effectively demonstrate compliance, then they would issue an EC certificate, and that would allow you to place your device on the market. So when we see in this process, we see that the manufacturers is going to develop this technical documentation, also implementing a quality management system, and these items are going to be reviewed during the conformity assessment process by notified body. And once this is done, the CE certificate will be issued, and the manufacturers will be able to draw a declaration of conformity. What has changed with the medical device regulation, or let's say what has been reinforced rather than changed, is that there is now higher expectation to have clinical evaluation in the technical file, so clinical evidence through the clinical evaluation, which is mandatory. And of course, within the quality management system, the notified body will expect that you have SOPs, so procedure that cover correctly your clinical investigation or your clinical activity in more general term. And typically the notified body has to check during the conformity assessment process that the data you collect are relevant, they are appropriate to support the claim. They also have to check that the way you're designing the study are relevant, there is no bias, there is no limitation. They also have to check that the data acquired are being legit, meaning that you have complied to regulation, and at the end take position on the robustness of the data. If, as a medical device manufacturer, now you're looking for what are the main requirements to define your clinical investigation, I would say that there is mainly two sets of requirements, but at the end there is only one framework, which is the good clinical practices. So as I mentioned before, the medical device regulation now integrates in its Article 62 to 80 specific requirements for clinical investigation. Interestingly, when you compare those requirements to the to the good clinical practices, you see only minor differences. So at the end of the day, if you apply good clinical practices, you mainly, I would say mainly, because it's not fully, but you mainly cover the requirement of the MDR. Those good clinical practices are defined for a long period of time already, and you find them in the ISO 14155. So this is an ISO standard, which was a harmonized standard for 80 years. And basically this standard has the same purpose as the ECH GCP for the pharma world. So the pharma world is basically following specifically good clinical practices, which are defined in those ECH guidance, whereas medical devices are subject to ISO 14155, which at the end of the day are quite similar in terms of requirements. I'm going to go through those a little bit later, but as a fundamental rule, what we can say, and this is a point which is really important, is that any systematic investigation that is involving one or more human subject, and which is done to undertake and assess the safety or performance of the device, they shall comply with the GCP. So whatever action you're taking with your device, you need to, let's say, clinical activities you're undertaking with your device, you always need to consider the good clinical practices and how you have to respond to those requirements. In some cases, there can be a fine line between what is a clinical investigation and a research project. So typically, if you think of a usability study, interestingly, when you're making a usability study, you can claim that you're investigating the safety of your device, or you can also claim that you're investigating the behavior of the user. So you might need ethical permission to do so, but maybe you might not need. So it depends basically on what you're specifically trying to do. What I would here recommend is that if there is a doubt, to have, if you fall within a clinical investigation or not, then you should ask the local ethical committee, basically by formulating the question, explaining what you want to do. And normally the ethical committee will respond to you to say, well, you're subject to ethical approval or you're not subject to ethical approval. It is important to do so because if later on in the process you should have had the authorization of the ethical committee and you didn't ask for it, then your data will be considered as invalid. In terms of overall requirement for the clinical investigation, as I mentioned, it needs to be authorized. So you need to have the ethical committee who will give you an acceptance for you to perform your study. And in some cases, you also need the approval of the competent authority. This, let's say, it's for all investigation with the medical devices, except when the device has already a CE mark. If your device is already CE marked and it's used within its intended purpose, then you don't need to have the approval from the competent authority. All the other cases need the approval of the competent authority. And then the second main aspect is, as I mentioned, you need to follow the ethical principle which are set in the Declaration of Helsinki. So there is mainly 32 principles, which are defined in the good clinical practices. And at the end, the key aspect is typically to ensure the well-being of the patient, so that the patient are not going through more risk than needed. You also need to address a relevant scientific question. So basically, you cannot just do a clinical investigation for the sake of doing a clinical investigation. So if you want to do a clinical investigation for marketing purpose, this is not really a good purpose to make a clinical investigation. You need to find a scientific question to address. It should also be performed only on subjects who provided an informed consent. This is the key aspect of the Helsinki principle. And you also need to ensure that you have the necessary competences and resources. At the end, you need to ensure that all the good clinical practices are being addressed correctly when you run your clinical investigation. The MDR in its Annex 15 has also defined a set of requirements, of general requirements that every clinical investigation have to follow. You can see that we have again here the ethical principles. So you can see that this is clearly a constant in this situation. It also needs to be defined and conform with the state of the art. So making your literature review to define the state of the art is quite fundamental. You need to have procedure to cover the device and the activities for the clinical investigation. You need to follow appropriate research methodology. So you really, this go back to this planning activity to be sure that the way it's being conducted is appropriate. You also need to have a representative devices for or it need to be representative of the intended normal condition of use in line with the clinical evaluation plan. So, and this needs to be statistically relevant. So if you want to plan a study, you need to be sure that this study is actually representative of the setup you will use for the device. You need to use representative device. So this is quite interesting, typically for new product which are being developed. So if I have a prototype, this question is actually come back very often to us. I have a prototype, it's not a final device, it will change over many times. Is my device okay to make a clinical investigation with that device? Well, the answer is always, it depends. It might be sufficient if the technical and safety feature are the same. Now, of course, if you make a clinical investigation with a device and then you change your device, you will have to justify why the clinical data you have collected are still valid for your new device. So it's always useful to consider the roadmap of development of your product to be sure that you're not doing costly research on a device which may change in the future. You need to have relevant safety and performance endpoints, and you also need to have qualified investigator who are performing the study, meaning that the investigator you'll be working with need to know and understand your type of device. And finally, you need to document a complete clinical investigation report, and I'll come back to that right after. In terms of studies, there is always a question, which is basically, okay, how many patients do I need in my study? Well, it depends what you're willing to do. Of course, you may have a very early prototype where you need to demonstrate the proof of concept. You're far from having a device which is finalized, and you want to verify that the basic design or the basic observation you had typically on animals are valid on human standpoint. So what you try to do with your pilot study is mainly to confirm an idea, or mainly to confirm a trend, or to reassure the fact that you have no reason to believe that there is issue with the device, or at least from the mode of operation. So of course, here the logic of statistical aspect are not so important, because at the end of the day, you just want to validate some key concept. But then you also need to keep in mind that those studies won't be sufficient to get the market access. So it's not because you have done a clinical investigation on 5 patients that this will be sufficient to go for a CE mark. Nonetheless, those studies really needs to also be done according to the good practices, not only because it's a legal requirement, but they also contributing to your pivotal study design later on. So when you justify your pivotal study, you will typically be, it will be helpful to be able to refer to your pilot study or pilot studies, the observation, to justify typically the endpoints that you will have included in your pivotal study. The pivotal study is typically the study which should be statistically significant, so meaning having enough patients to demonstrate what you want to prove. And those studies will be reviewed by the notified body in order to assess if your claim are justified. And then, as presented by Peter a little bit earlier, you have the post-market studies, which will be conducted when the device is already on the market and which will be used to continuously address further safety and performance aspect. In terms of activity to plan, what we can see is that we have multiple stages. So we have the first aspect, which is typically having the study design. So defining how you want to study how you want to define your study, what you're going to do. Then you need to do this approval. So you need to go to the ethical committee and possibly the competent authority to get the approval. And once you get those approval, you can start the activity by site initiation, which is formally opening the clinical investigation. Then during the clinical investigation, subject will be enrolled. So basically people will sign up for the study. They will be processed by the investigator. And usually there is a follow-up period where we're going to measure the impact of the device. And once we have processed enough patients, there will be a formal closing of the study, and then there will be reporting. What needs to be also keep in mind, and that's really important, is that there is two main additional activity you need to take into consideration, which is the monitoring activity. So you need to ensure that the activity are being conducted in compliance with the requirements, that the data are being collected correctly. And you also need to ensure that the proper safety reporting is being implemented. So if you have safety adverse events occurring during your clinical investigation, you have to report those events to ethical committee and competent authorities. So this is something that you want to ensure because it's your responsibility to do so. So when we see that, first question is, where do I start? Okay, the main aspect that you want to work on first is to define the endpoints. It may sound quite basic, but at the end of the day, when you plan a clinical investigation, this will be a significant effort that will be costly, that will take time. So at the end, what is the question that you want or that you need to answer? And this question usually will pop out from the literature review. So the idea is first to go through the clinical, to perform a first iteration of your clinical evaluation. So review the literature out there, review the safety and adverse events that are known in database. So you're going to compile the state of the art. You're going to identify how other studies have been conducted and what data they have generated. And based on this information, you will be able to define the endpoints you need to demonstrate safety and performance of your device. It's important to do that before you go and meet with your clinical partner, because your clinical partner may have other objectives in terms of clinical research, because clinical partners, especially in university, might be interested to explore new questions, which are scientifically very interesting, but which might not be really relevant for your clinical, to demonstrate the safety and performance of your device. So in that prospect, it's important that you have a clear idea of what you want to investigate before you start to interact with a clinical investigator. And then with who are you going to perform the study? Of course, there is multiple setup you can find. What is quite interesting is to get closer to academia, because academia offer a wide range of experts who are usually very qualified in their research field. What you need to keep in mind is that those researchers might be extremely qualified in their field, but they might not be clinical experts, meaning that they might not run clinical investigation every day. They might not be completely aware of all the requirements and all the rules that apply for this type of activity. So when you're selecting your clinical investigator, it's typically important to ensure that the investigator has appropriate competence in the field of your device. So I mean, he knows basically how to use, or how to use and how to perform the different surgical or clinical activity related to your device. You also need to ensure that the investigator's team and structure can host or manage a clinical investigation. And this is an issue we have observed very often. I mean, you can go in very well set up hospital. They have very qualified people. They have a very good equipment. Everything looks really fine. The only problem is that they have other activity to do than to run your clinical investigation. So at the end of the day, you need to be sure that there is someone at the clinical site who will be able to process the activities, not necessarily the investigator himself, but maybe, I don't know, a PhD student or somebody else working in the team who will actually implement the activity. If you're expecting that the head of a clinical department is going to run himself clinical investigation, you might be disappointed because usually those people have other activity to conduct on a daily basis. You also want to be sure that the investigator is formally trained on GCP. That is really important because if you are discussing with somebody highly qualified and you realize that this person is not qualified to run the study because he's not trained on GCP, that can be a little problem in the relation with this investigator. You also want to check that the investigator has already run studies as a principal investigator. That will avoid you some surprise when the investigator discovers the rule in the process. And you also want to discuss the recruitment rate. And the recruitment rate is the main pitfall every manufacturers will always encounter, is that when you discuss with the clinical site, they always tell you that there is a lot of patients, everybody will be happy to participate in the study, so it's going to be easy and rapid. And at the end, you realize that it's not so easy to recruit patients. So you need to ensure that there is enough patient coming to the center. You need to ensure that there is an effective process in place to explain the study to the possible candidate and to go through to recruit them, to motivate them to participate to the study. Otherwise, it's possible that your study is going to last 2 or 3 times what you have expected in the first place. Last question, who should be the sponsor? This question comes often, especially from startups. Larger company usually take the role of sponsor without any discussion because they want to be the sponsor. With startups, of course, there is always this question to say, I mean, can we be part of a self-sponsored study by the university and they just use our device? The answer is yes, of course. You don't have to be, as a manufacturer, the sponsor, especially when you're becoming a sponsor, it comes with cost and responsibility. The point is that at the end of the day, if you're the sponsor, you are in relative control of the study, because as a sponsor, you have responsibility associated with the study, typically in terms of quality control and so on and so forth. So you obviously have access to the information, and you have also the role in driving and leading the principal investigator. If you're not the sponsor, if you're just a manufacturer who provide the device, then you have a limited possibility to participate in the clinical investigation, and then the principal investigator has all roles and responsibilities, which can be okay or not, but this is typically something that is important to define with your investigator. In terms of role, of course, the 2 main roles, so we have the investigator, as I mentioned, is responsible to conduct the clinical investigation and has the responsibility to perform the activities according to the GCP. So of course, the clinician is the person who is going to use the device, process the patient, execute the clinical activities, collect the data, report the data, and so on and so forth. The sponsor, on the other hand, has the responsibility for the quality assurance and quality control of the study. So typically, if the monitoring activities need to be ensured by the sponsor need to ensure that the safety reporting is being done with competent authorities, ethical committee. The sponsor also need to ensure that the patients are being processed legally, meaning that they have provided the informed consent and so on and so forth. So if something goes wrong within the study, as a sponsor, you're also responsible. So this is your responsibility to ensure that the study is being conducted in an appropriate way. What is really important here, and this is something that really needs to be implemented, normally it's checked by most of the ethical committee, is that there is a research contract which is in place between the investigator and the sponsor. And this research contract should clarify role and responsibility with regard to safety reporting, with regard to monitoring, with regard to data compilation, and so on and so forth. What you also need as a sponsor, if you're a manufacturer, you also have to ensure that the activity which are performed, they are performed in a correct way and they are performed systematically. So you need to ensure that you have a quality management system, or at least a set of SOP, but usually that would be SOP which are part of your quality management system. And these SOP needs to cover the different activities, in particular that the study is according to the protocol and applicable regulations. So this is typically monitoring activity. You need to ensure that the proper records are being developed and maintained. So we need to ensure that the data collected are being processed, are collected correctly, they are documented correctly, they're stored correctly, and so on and so forth. And you need also to ensure that some specific requirements are correctly implemented. So typically, if you're using an ECRF to collect data, you need to ensure that this device is validated, this software is validated. If you're using other type of software, you need to ensure that those software is being validated. You need to ensure that competences are appropriately managed. You need to ensure the monitoring, you need to ensure the safety reporting. So at the end of the day, in your quality management system, you need to define a set of SOP that will cover the different activities you will perform within a clinical investigation. This being said, of course, designing a complete set of SOP can take time. If you do that for only one study, maybe that's not relevant. And that's where you might be willing to delegate these activities either to the university research center, sometimes they have organizations that take these activities, or directly to a clinical research organization. In practice, if you want to make your study efficient, as a manufacturer, you should mainly take into consideration the following point. So you first want to be sure that your endpoints are based on sound clinical evaluation. You want and you need to be able to justify your endpoint and why you have chosen them and how they're going to contribute to demonstrate what you want to demonstrate. You also need to take the lead in developing the clinical trial application. Of course, this will be done with the investigator, but you should definitely keep the lead. You are able to implement it, you're able to prepare the documentation, you're able to submit it, and it's going to be simpler and faster if you're the main, if you take the lead on this, on the generating those documents. From our experience, what we have also observed is that you should keep all the communication with you. So all interaction with the ethical committee and the competent authority should be supervised by the manufacturers. Of course, most of the time it is considered that the communication with the ethical committee is being done by the principal investigator, which is correct. In most of the European countries, the sponsor can do it as well, and you actually should do it. The idea behind this is to ensure that you have consistent communication and you're able to follow up on the different interaction. You also want to ensure that you have proper monitoring activity, and this is really key because that's your assurance that you will have robust data, that you don't have flaws in your data. You also want to follow up closely on safety reporting because you need to be sure that this is being done. This is a legal obligation and you want to be sure that this is being done. You also should consider to use electronic case report form. What we see now with most ethical committees is that they don't really accept anymore logging data in Excel spreadsheet and those kind of things. They want to be sure that the data are being controlled in a robust way. And you have multiple solutions for electronic CRF, and you should typically consider using one of them. And last but not least, a very important point, and this is my statistician or statistician who says it repeatedly, he said, discuss with the statistician before and not after. Because once you have started your clinical investigation, when you realize that your study is not statistically relevant because the difference you're trying to show is too small, so you need a huge number of patients or something like this, that can be quite a problem. And it's not because your ethical committee has approved your study that it is necessarily valid for CE marking. As a recap and a conclusion, if you want to follow a step-by-step in organizing your clinical investigation, again, first of all, perform your clinical evaluation. Take some time to do a correct clinical evaluation because that's really the root of your clinical activities, and define and use this to define endpoints. Get the training on GCP. At the end of the day, if you don't know what is GCP in the detail, it's going to be complicated to address everything. I mean, GCP training are usually given in training 1 to 3 days. They are not taking so much time, they are not so expensive, and they're really useful because you have a good set of requirements that you have to address during this study. And anyway, as a sponsor, you also need to be able to show that you have competences in this field. You want to identify clinical partners and agree on roles and activities. So you certainly want to have a good contract which is set up. You also want to ensure that your device is representative and correctly verified. So finalize your device in this function. It doesn't need to be a final device with the proper casing and everything, but you want to be sure that the device is safe, and you want to be sure that the function that you're going to implement in your device are representative of what you will have in your marketed device. You also need to check your quality management system to ensure that you have covered correctly clinical activities, or you can decide to hire a CRO to do that for you. Then you want to develop your clinical trial application and get it authorized. Again, keep the communication on this, follow up on the documentation. Then you have to implement the appropriate sponsor activities. So typically what is devoted to the sponsors, such as the monitoring and so on and so forth. And once your study is completed, take time to formalize correctly your clinical investigation report. This document is really important because it's likely that your notified body is going to ask for it. So when they review the clinical evaluation, they will see that you have data set coming from your own clinical investigation, and they will actually ask your clinical investigation report, and they're likely also to ask your clinical investigation protocol and all the data associated actually. So be sure that this clinical investigation report is well defined, well justified, so that you can leverage correctly the data in the future. If you plan to publish a paper, it's the right time to do it, because most of the paper peer-reviewed journal actually ask you about ethical considerations. So then you have done more or less everything and you can publish your paper. And once this is done, you want to update your clinical evaluation report with the data that you have acquired. So we have spent a little bit more time than originally expected, but we have been able to cover these different aspects. Just going to check if there is additional question in the chatter. There is no additional question in the chatter. So it is the right time for me to thank you for participating to this presentation. I hope the information that we have presented today will be useful for you in the future. If you have question, follow-up question on this presentation, feel free to send us emails, so that way we can respond to the question. I also take the advantage to remind you that next week, May 20, we have what we call regulatory checkup. So the regulatory checkup is a session that we organize where we have our experts available for 1 hour. That's all for today. I wish you a very good day and hope to hear from you in the future.